Russian forces continue advancing to the north and south of Minarat as fighting over the city continues. The Russians have full physical control over the southern parts of Minarat and are pushing through the forest lines west of the city to push the remaining Ukrainian soldiers into the city, and advancing along the apartment complex area in the central parts and up to the northern parts. At the same time, the Russians continue offensive operations in the northern parts, gaining full control over the northern apartment complex area and pushing into the residential area to the south of it, alongside the main road to the north. The Russians are here looking to close the northern connection along the waste heap and the roads leading into the central parts of the city, where the industrial and railway station area connects with the Russian forces operating from the east, west and north, to connect their forces from these three directions and isolate the western parts near Svitle and the southern parts along the apartment complex areas, the central and eastern ones from the southern parts. The Russians are here splitting the city into several parts: northwestern, central, south part of the central, and then advancing alongside the southern parts, which would mean the southern, central and northern section, which will be cut by the forces connecting between the northern, western and eastern directions. The southern push aims at connecting the forces between the southern parts of Minarat to the eastern parts of Pokrosk along the railway line, where the Russians will be able to use their forces from the Pokrosk direction to safely transfer to the Minarat direction and gain full control over the city itself as they continue their slow advance aimed at gaining full control over the city and closing the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces and clearing it from all the remaining forces operating within the city to regain full control over Minarat and continue pushing onwards beyond that of Minarat into Hryshene, Rodenske and Dnipropetrovsk. To the southwest of Minarat, the Russians made a significant advance within Hulyaipole, gaining control over much of the eastern flank along the river line and the forest lines. To the southeast of the city, the Russians have managed to gain control over the farm areas and pushed into the eastern residential area, gaining control over the eastern school, as well as the first fortifications within the eastern parts, and connecting with the forces further north of the Hulyaipole River, where the Russians have gained control over the eastern residential area, the fortified positions alongside it, the first line of defense. And with this, the Russians have now breached the first line of defense in the southeastern parts of the city, gaining full control over the fortifications along the first line of defense to the east of Hulyaipole, both along the Zelenihai-Vesele roads towards Satishia and Hulyaipole, and alongside the southeastern roads connected to Mariupol in the southeast. This is a very significant advance that clearly shows the ambition of the Russian forces to gain full control over Hulyaipole by fighting through it. Based on this, we have to now look at the city as a conquest battle, not a probing battle or attrition battle. With that in mind, the city itself is split into several parts. There's the northern parts north of the Hulyaipole River, which is isolated from the main part of the city and is located on the northern bank of the river line, from which there is a residential area, just regular residential buildings with some fortifications on the outskirts of it, some farm areas. All of this adds up to a not very defensible position, but also a difficult position for the Russians to hold on to without taking a lot of casualties, as there's no areas where they can gather their forces. They'd have to spread out their forces in residential buildings. This matches their recent tactics of using FPV drones with assault troops, where infantry clears buildings, and drones where the drones help the assault forces by detecting Ukrainian soldiers and directing fire towards them before the Russians clear the rubble after such a strike. The Russian forces will be slowly advancing through the northern residential area with few infantry and a lot of drones to clear the northern buildings north of the Hulyaipole River, where the Ukrainians will have a limited resistance as well, while the main force will be pushing through from the eastern roads, where we see both the additional streets of the city itself, where the Russian forces will have a lot more area they can push the infantry through. But again, there's no major defensive positions. There's a lot of fortifications on the southern outskirts, but there's no area where the Russians can gather their forces. Instead, again, they will be spread out throughout the city, but on a much larger area. The Russians, with an armored push, would have been able to drop off the infantry and spread them across the city, from where drones will be mainly supporting the Russian forces to gain control over the trenches, fortifications, and residential buildings. However, in the central parts of the city, there is some apartment complex buildings, school areas, and so on, which is an area where the Ukrainians can concentrate their forces and with the help of drones slow down Russian attacks. However, it is very concentrated in the central parts of the city. There's no major areas. There's the western industrial / farm area, and then there's the central apartment complex / industrial / farm area where the Ukrainian forces can concentrate their forces. But with the support of FAB bombs, the Russians will be able to destroy these areas and clear the city with the use of their infantry and drones, as they have been clearing Pokrosk and Minarat. Based on this, with the entry of Russian forces to the southeast through Hulyaipole and the east through Zatishya, the Russians will be able to clear Hulyaipole, and the main battle over the city itself has begun, with Russian forces closing in from the north along the defensive line, from the east from Zatishya and Melinivka, and from the southeast through Hulyaipole, where the Russians will be focusing on clearing the fortifications to the south to gain control over the highway leading into Hulyaipole from the south, and with that, it will only be a matter of time before the Russians gain full control over the city. And the capture of Hulyaipole will have a decisive effect on the logistics of the Russian forces in this section of the front line, with significantly stronger logistics, with the rail connection going all the way just south of Hulyaipole and trucks being able to supply directly to Hulyaipole. The Russians will be able to properly supply the forces in this section of the front line, speeding up their offensive operations along the first and second lines of defense, as they'll be able to push through the second line of defense by advancing alongside the battle over the city itself, where the Russians have enough forces on a wide enough front line that the Ukrainians will be able to choose between the northern and southern flanks, which will they defend, and the Russians will be able to concentrate their forces alongside the entire front, where they can capture whichever part the Ukrainians aren't concentrating their forces at. Or if the Ukrainians are spreading out their forces as well, then the Russians will be having a steady advance along the entire front, as we have seen throughout the month. To the northeast of Pokrosk, the Russians continue offensive operations towards Sofiivka, gaining control over the defensive lines to the southeast of the town, and the remaining residential area of Shahove here to the south. With this, the Russians continue offensive operations on the southeastern flank, gaining control over additional forest lands and residential buildings, and reaching the outskirts of Sofiivka from the eastern and southern flanks. Continuing the offensive operations along the defensive lines that is connected between Troshkivka in the north to Minarat and Pokrosk in the south. To the east of this, the Russians continue offensive operations north of Alexandro-Kelinova and Yablonivka, gaining control over additional fortifications north of the towns. The Russians are here working on a pincer maneuver from the western highway through the 20504 highway and from the southern highway, where they are flanking the positions and fortifications of the Ukrainians north of Yablonivka to connect their forces between the eastern and western directions and gain control over the entire area here north of Yablonivka, which will allow them to direct their forces in the northwestern direction towards Stepanivka and north and eastern direction through the 20504 highway towards Bereztok and then onwards towards Kostiantinivka itself. We are also seeing some movement in areas that hasn't moved for years. The Russians have managed to gain control over the town of Maisky to the north of Chesev Yar, gaining control over an area that has been fought over for many months. The Russians with this have captured Maisky itself and the fortifications in the eastern flank. This connects the Russian forces from Chesev Yar to the northern flank, where they continue pressure on Novomarkova and Markova to the north and east of these positions, where they're slowly clearing the high ground and the fortifications the Ukrainians have on the flanks of Kostiantinivka. The Russians' objective here is not just to put Kostiantinivka in an operational encirclement, but to expand that to the entire Sloviansk-Kostiantinivka line, where they'll be attacking all of the positions of the Ukrainians on both flanks of the defensive line and not directly storm it itself. We see the Russian operations from the southeast of Kostiantinivka that is mainly opportunistic, based on the fact that they have control over the high ground and the fortifications weren't well manned due to the Ukrainian incessant counterattacks towards Toretsk, which grinded up a lot of the forces the Ukrainians had available in the area. The Russians took advantage of the gap and the difference between the power of manpower and firepower between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in the area to push up towards the city. However, taking control over the city itself would require a lot more resources that is currently directed towards Pokrosk, Minarat, and the eastern parts of the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions. Instead, the Russian forces are mainly working here on the flanks near Chesev Yar, Yablonivka, and then onwards towards Drushkivka, and then Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. With the push coming from the Siversk and Liman directions, the Russians would gain control over the northern and eastern flanks of the Sloviansk-Kashentsynivka line, and with the push through towards Drushkivka, and then onwards from Pokrosk and Minarat towards Dobropilya, and then the rear of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, both the Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Drushkivka, and Kashentsynivka directions would all be encircled by the Russian forces operating to the north and west of this defensive line. As for the northwestern flank of Bahmut, the Russians advance here to the northwest of Selesnyansk for the first time in years, where the Russians continue offensive operations here in the vicinity of Vasyokivka, where they've managed to advance within the town itself, and advance further to the north of Selesnyansk, where they'll look to connect their forces operating on both flanks to bypass the defensive line of the Ukrainians along the river line, connect their forces between Vasyokivka and Selesnyansk by advancing in the direction of Bondarne. To the north of this, the Russians managed to advance in the direction of Wufchansk as well, both in the direction of Vilcha towards Liman, and in the east continuing advancing along the city itself. The Russians have managed to gain control over the southern outskirts, some of the forest lines, and the residential area in the eastern parts, as well as the northern residential area, pushing through what remains in the central parts of the city and isolating the forces between the west and the east. The Russian objective here is to gain full control over Wufchansk, while at the same time they're also pushing in the southern direction towards Vilcha, gain control over that as an outpost facing the southern direction for resupplies going into and towards Wufchansk, and the western direction towards Liman, and the positions along the forest patch area gain control over the Sversky Donetsk river on both banks of the river line, gaining control over additional crossings into Wufchansk along the forest patch area, and advancing along the river line in general to gain control over the area as a wide flank on the western flank of these positions. Gaining control over the river line itself could act as a major advantage for the Russians if they're able to cut off the western highway going towards Kharkiv by advancing along the Sversky Donetsk river line, which acts as a natural barrier between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in close vicinity to Kharkiv. The Russians can create the entire area here north of Kupiansk as a death zone where the Ukrainian forces cannot operate because Russians would have control over the flanks with the capture of Kupiansk in the east and a push from the west. However, that is a far distance that cannot be considered as a direct threat for the Ukrainian forces as it stands right now. However, it can quickly develop following the capture of Wufchansk for Russian offensive operations to develop beyond that along the river line in the future. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.